It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for our panel, Elizabeth Slattery. Elizabeth is the Director of Constitutional Scholarship at Pacific Legal Foundation. She leads a team at PLF that incubates and promotes legal theories among elite legal audiences like this to prepare the ground for courts and policymakers. Elizabeth's team produces very, very cutting-edge scholarship. I've read much of it myself. It's quite insightful, highly recommended. They regularly testify before federal and state policymakers, and they appear in a variety of media. Elizabeth herself is a widely followed thought leader. Her writing has appeared in a number of law reviews, as well as the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and of course the Federalist Society Review. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth and the panel.
Thank you. So this plenary session will explore two timely subjects of debate: whether the Constitution permits the president to impound congressionally appropriated funds and levy tariffs. Congress, of course, holds the power of the purse. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. And Article 1, Section 9 limits federal spending to that made in consequence of appropriations made by law. Various statutes have been interpreted to allow presidential tariff actions that address national security and economic emergencies. And proponents of an energetic executive argue that congressional appropriations place a ceiling on what the president may spend, not a floor. Are these actions within the express or implied executive power? Alternatively, may Congress delegate to the president the power to levy tariffs? These questions have been brought into the spotlight by recent Trump administration actions that are aimed at curbing government spending, advancing national security interests, and jump-starting our domestic economy. And the Supreme Court has already entered the fray, ordering the administration to temporarily halt its plan to slash USAID funding. Dozens of other suits have been filed challenging cuts to universities, research facilities, public broadcasting, and state governments. On the tariff front, there are only a modest 6 challenges to date, including one brought by some of my colleagues at Pacific Legal Foundation. These constitutional issues will no likely be before the Supreme Court before long. To discuss all this, we're fortunate to have a panel of experts with us. I will briefly introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. First up is Eric Bolander. He's an assistant professor at Liberty University School of Law. He joined the academy after a 10-year career in public interest litigation. Most notably, Eric argued a little case called Loper-Bright Enterprises at the DC Circuit and was part of the team that sailed from the district court through the Supreme Court's landmark decision. And he's wearing a fish tie clip, you should know. He's really committed. Eric's scholarship focuses on administrative and constitutional law, including how courts should implement Loper-Bright, and most recently, the constitutionally defined boundaries of the tariff power. Eric earned his law degree from Georgetown and his undergraduate degree from James Madison University. Next up is Trent McCotter. He's a partner with Boyd & Gray PLLC, where he leads their administrative law practice. He previously served as Deputy Associate Attorney General of the United States and as an Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia. This spring, Trent argued two related Supreme Court cases asking the justices to enforce the Constitution's requirement that Congress impose meaningful limits on how much power bureaucratic federal agencies can exercise. He also directs the Separation of Powers Clinic at Catholic University's Columbus School of Law. Trent is a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and the University of North Carolina School of Law. Then we'll hear from Dr. Philip Wallach. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies America's separation of powers with a focus on regulatory policy issues and the relationship between Congress and the administrative state. His latest book, Why Congress? He develops the centrality of Congress in America's constitutional system, traces the roots of current dysfunction, and suggests how the institution might be restored. Before joining AEI, he was a senior fellow at Brookings, R Street, and he served as a fellow with the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. Philip earned his master's and doctorate in politics from Princeton University and a bachelor's degree from Wesleyan. And last but not least, the Honorable Eric Soskin is a senior advisor to Governor Ron DeSantis. He leads Florida's DOGE initiative, identifying wasteful and unnecessary spending within state government, local governments, state colleges, and universities. Eric previously served as the Inspector General for the U.S. Department of Transportation, where he guided audits identifying improvements to the department's efficiency and effectiveness, as well as opportunities to combat waste and fraud. He also led DOT's principal law enforcement component, with over 100 federal law enforcement officers investigating crimes against America's transportation networks. Eric spent 14 years at the Department of Justice, serving as senior trial counsel and counselor to the Assistant Attorney General. He's a graduate of Williams College and Harvard Law School. So with that, we'll start with Eric.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to the Federal Society for having us here today to talk about these very timely topics. So I'm going to start by talking about the tariff power. I'm going to set the table a little bit for myself and Trent with sort of a statement of facts of what happened. I'm going to argue that the president's use of the tariff power under IEPA is unconstitutional. Trent's going to tell you why I'm wrong. And then we're going to go from there. We'll have a great discussion. Trent and I have been talking about this over email for the last couple of weeks, so it's just great to build my own ideas off him. So let me start with what happened. The president used a statute called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. I think I got that right, which I will just call IEPA for short. That's a fun acronym. Congress passed IEPA in 1976. In my view, others may disagree, the aim of it was to cut down on the amount of power the executive could exercise in a preceding statute called the Trading with the Enemies Act, right? Which had a lot of issues with it. It had a lot of expansive authority. There's some case law on it. And IEPA was supposed to constrain the president's powers. But it still grants the president broad powers. It says he can use IEPA, and I'm quoting from the statute, to deal with any unusual or extraordinary threat which has its source outside the United States to national security, foreign policy, or the economy. But there's a threshold finding that the president must declare a national emergency with that threat. So in February, President Trump issued executive orders against Canada and Mexico, implementing tariffs on them, declaring a national emergency and making the threshold finding. And then on April 2nd, with what President Trump has coined as Liberation Day, he imposed tariffs on virtually every country. And there was a finding of a national emergency, and in support of that, he said there was a lack of reciprocity in trade agreements between countries, and there were large and persistent annual U.S. goods trade deficits. He introduced a blanket floor of 10% on tariffs, and then he had specific tariffs on nations that were according to a formula and went up to 50% on most nations, with the exception of China, which had extraordinarily high tariffs, I think as high as 150% at one point. A week later, he issued a 90-day pause on the tariffs, but that sustained the 10% blanket tariffs, and it sustained the high level of tariffs on China. So a number of lawsuits have been filed by the New Civil Liberties Alliance, the Pacific Legal Foundation, Liberty Justice Center, a group of Democratic state attorneys general, and Gavin Newsom, which is the greatest crossover event in history, if you ask me, right? What a coalition. And so, as you can see, there's a lot of bipartisan interest now. You might see some different arguments from the Democrat state attorneys general, as you would from some of the conservative groups. But that brings us to today. So let me talk about my viewpoint on this. Like I said, I'm going to argue that this is an unconstitutional use of the power, and I'm going to argue that this violates the Constitution's non-delegation doctrine. The non-delegation doctrine, as I'm sure many of you know, but just as a quick recap, is a principle that finds itself in the vesting clause of Article 1 of the Constitution. Congress cannot give away powers that are expressly reserved to that body. They cannot just delegate away the ability to act as a legislator to the executive. The doctrine's been weak lately, unless Trent is successful at the Supreme Court, right? We have a great chance of that at Consumers Research, right? But the doctrine has been rather weak, and it's been hamstrung by something called the intelligible principle test. I think the last time, Trent, correct me if I'm wrong, that the test was used to strike down something was 1935 in Schechter Poultry, right? So it has been a weak test that says you have to have an intelligible principle for the president to act. But Justice Gorsuch's powerful dissent in the Gundy case, which was joined by a number of justices, has really laid out a great opportunity as we move forward to revive the non-delegation doctrine. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're about to talk about a national security power. Isn't the non-delegation doctrine a little bit weaker in that context? Yes, and I will concede that, but let me give you the contours of that. So I don't think the court needs to reinvigorate the non-delegation doctrine to strike down the tariffs here as applied. It needs to apply the many, many precedents that we have in case law of how the tariff power should work and what Congress can delegate away. So let me first start with where the tariff power comes from. It's in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Article 1, not 2 or 3, 1, that the Congress can lay and collect taxes, duties, and tariffs. We'll use those terms interchangeably, and they've been used interchangeably in history. Imposts and excises to pay the debts and provide for the common defense. It's a revenue-raising section of the Constitution. These are specifically enumerated powers. This is not some sort of general power that the Congress is grabbing from somewhere else in the Constitution. The power to levy duties is specifically enumerated in Article 1, Section 8. Why were the founders so concerned about this? Because they were cognizant of how the king had abused this power. In fact, in the Declaration of Independence, it specifically complains about the king cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, and then I believe the very next sentence, imposing taxes on us without our consent. The founders knew these were serious powers. So, even the early founders, though, saw a point and a reason for tariffs in a protectionist way. George Washington, I thought this was funny, wrote in a letter to Marquis de Lafayette, "I use no porter or cheese in my family, but such as is made in America. Both these articles may now be purchased of an excellent quality." That is the first Buy American campaign I was able to locate in our history, right? And some of the earliest statutes passed by Congress dealt with using the tariff authority for protectionist means, right, to protect infant industry. But these statutes were specified with exactitude with Congress as the first mover. Let me give you an example. Uncovered in another law review, a congressional debate between a gentleman from Virginia who wanted 3 cents a bushel tariff on coal to protect infant Virginia coal industry. A gentleman from Pennsylvania thought that might threaten industry there, so he wanted 1 cent per bushel. They argued back and forth. They decided on 3 cents. So now you're going to say, but wait. Can't they delegate some of this away to the president because it is dealing with national security, it is dealing with international trade? Isn't there a bit of a watered-down non-delegation on this? Well, if you look historically, the courts have consistently held that the thing that may be delegated away to the president on the tariff power, which is more generous than other delegations, is the power to find facts and execute on the tariffs, the type of core executive powers that you would assume, whereas the Congress has always reserved for itself, at least till this moment, the power to actually set the tariffs themselves. So let me use a case to talk to you about this. This is Marshall Field v. Clark. It's from 1892. It was a non-delegation challenge to the Tariff Act of 1890. They were saying the president can't turn tariffs on and off. That's a delegation of authority. Clark recognized the non-delegation doctrine. Congress cannot delegate legislative power to the president. This is a principle universally recognized, the integrity and maintenance of the system of government. But here, what this statute had done is it had set a bunch of tariffs and then said to the president, if you find a lack of reciprocity or you find reciprocity that is harmful to our interests, you may turn the tariffs on or you may turn the tariffs off. What the president may not do under that statute is say what the tariffs are. And that's why the court in Clark upheld that delegation of the tariff power. It says it, and this is a quote, Congress itself prescribed in advance the duties to be levied, collected, or paid on specific enumerated goods. He can examine the regulations from other countries. He can decide whether they are reasonable. But again, another quote, legislative power was exercised when Congress declared that a suspension could take effect on a named contingency. And if you look at the statute, let me read you some things from the statute. This is how specific it was. Molasses testing above 56 degrees, not 55, 56 degrees, 4 cents per gallon. Coffee, 3 cents per pound. Tea, 10 cents per pound. Angora goat skins, 1.5 cents, right? Congress was the first mover in specifying the goods and specifying the amount of the tariff and doing that core legislative function, and then it gave the keys to that to turn it on and off to the president. So the thing we have here is that we have a president, he decided the goods that would be tariffed. He decided what country would be tariffed. He decided at the rate they would be tariffed. He decided when the tariffs would start and the tariffs would finish, which maybe that's one of the powers that could be delegated away. These are all core legislative functions. And case after case after case after case, with one exception, and Trent's going to talk about it, and I'm going to let him go talk about it first, and then I have a response to it, in our history, has shown that the courts will uphold these powers, and they have upheld these delegations time and time again, but only if Congress is the one that had the core legislative function. This is a serious separation of powers issue. This is a serious issue about who is supposed to be the one that makes trade policy for the United States that affects the economy of the United States in substantial, substantial ways, right? And the Constitution is clear. It's in Article 1, Section 8. It's right there. It tells us who needs to do it, and then the Congress is able to give the keys to that engine off to the president. One final note before I hand it over to Trent, is I'm not here arguing whether tariffs are good or bad economic policy. That's not for me, that's not my expertise, right? If you love tariffs, I hope you also love the separation of powers. And you should go and lobby Congress and say, you can codify what the president is doing. Codify his tariff scheme. Put some specifics on it. Say what sort of fact-finding he needs to do to find a lack of reciprocity. I'm not saying that Congress could not turn some of this power over to the president, but at least in IEPA, it has not done that. And quite frankly, if we read, IEPA is very, very broad. So if we read this power into IEPA, this seems like a classic and easy non-delegation doctrine. If you're not going to draw the line here on non-delegation, I simply don't know where you would draw it. So I'll hand it over to Trent.
Thanks, Eric. As Eric and Elizabeth mentioned, 6 weeks ago, I think to the day, I stood at the Supreme Court and argued that a statute letting the Federal Communications Commission set domestic tax rates violates the non-delegation doctrine because Congress itself never imposed any rate, cap, limit, or formula. So you might think, given that I'd agree with him that Congress must impose similar restrictions on the imposition of tariffs. But actually, our merits brief in that case, Consumers Research VFCC at the Supreme Court, said that tariffs arguably are different because, as Eric acknowledged, they so clearly implicate Article II's foreign relations powers, unlike the domestic tax at issue in my case against the FCC. So I don't think Eric and I disagree with the very first proposition, which is that authorizing tariffs, like authorizing domestic taxes, is a legislative function, and that means that it must originate with Congress. But with a non-delegation challenge or inquiry, that's really just the first step and probably not even the most important, or at least not obviously so. The real question is, how specific does Congress have to be when they authorize them? And my SCOTUS brief argued that for tariffs, it actually depends on the nature of the power at issue, as it does with taxes. It's not always the same, even among Article I powers. So remember, for those who may or those who haven't read it, in the Wayman case, which was written by Chief Justice Marshall 200 years ago, he distinguished powers that are legislative, Article I, from those that are strictly and exclusively legislative, which was not a distinction I'd honestly thought of before I read the case. But in other words, there are powers that are overlapping between the president and Congress, at least areas that are overlapping. Think of immigration. Congress often legislates there with very broad language. Nobody thinks twice about it. But then there are areas, like domestic taxation in my case, where courts have said for centuries that power is exclusively legislative. And the way that we interpreted that at the Supreme Court was that means Congress must set all the policies and rules. At most, they could leave the president with some minor gap filling and execution powers. So the result of that is not all Article I powers should be treated the same. And it kind of makes some sense. In areas where there's some overlap between Congress and the president, it's going to be difficult to draw the line. Where did Congress have to go, and at what point could the president pick it up? Maybe there's not even a line. They might overlap. But in areas that are strictly legislative, then there is no overlap. And it's easier for courts to carry out the non-delegation inquiry, and it's also easier to say how far Congress itself had to go. So which side do tariffs fall on? I think there's a good argument that it's kind of like immigration. Congress can grant very broad and vague authority to the president because of that foreign relations aspect. So Justice Thomas made the same argument in his 2015 concurrence in the Amtrak case. This was originally supposed to be about whether Amtrak violated private non-delegation, which we could talk about another day. And the court ended up kind of dodging that, but he wrote separately about non-delegation. And he said that statutory delegations related to embargoes and tariffs, quote, arguably did not involve an exercise of core legislative power, end quote. Professor McConnell's made a similar argument, noting that a superior grounding for cases like Marshall Field, which Eric mentioned, and Curtis Wright, another well-known one, was that Congress had given the president, quote, a bargaining chip to use in foreign negotiations, which meant that Congress could essentially say, we will establish the authority to do this, and then the president has wide policy discretion on how to carry it out or if to carry it out. This also tracks English tradition, another point we raised in our Supreme Court brief. Parliament usually imposed very strict rules on domestic taxation, but in the words of the leading book on Parliament's purse powers, was, quote, much more liberal when it came to granting customs and duties powers to the king. And that book says it's unclear exactly why that's so, but it was probably a remnant of the king's power to protect shipping engaged in overseas trade, and of course to charge a premium for doing so. And accordingly, the king often had very broad powers to even change tariff rates. Now, of course, there was always some concern about the king being able to self-fund, but the English, and over several centuries, viewed that as just less of a problem when the money was imposed on imported goods than on themselves. And you could debate who actually pays duties and customs, but at least they viewed those things as being paid probably by companies and by foreigners and not by themselves. And second, Parliament, as Eric said, Congress could do. Parliament could, and sometimes did, overrule the king. They would impose new limits and say that certain goods could not have tariffs on them or customs. They sometimes negotiated compromises with the king that said, oh, you want to have duties this high on this thing? Okay, that's fine. But in the meantime, this other product that our constituents really care about, zero. And that's another way to resolve it. So what does all that mean for U.S. tariff statutes then? So under non-delegation, I would say, again, Congress must initially authorize them, but can do so under very vague terms that allow for significant policy discretion. I'd probably say it's something akin to the kind of watered-down intelligible principle test that some courts apply now. Did Congress require something like a national security finding, something about national emergencies, shortages, extraordinary threats, that sort of thing, which are, some of those are taken directly from IEPA? That's probably good enough. That's good enough policy for a tariff. Now, to be sure, Congress can be more specific. As Eric said, the very first tariff statute listed things down to the penny. And in Marshall Field, they had a statute that was what I'll call a contingent statute. If certain findings are made, then do X, and X was very clear. But that doesn't mean they have to. And of course, if Congress thinks that the president's gone too far, it could step back in and impose limits. I realize that's easier said than done. It might necessitate overriding a veto, but I think more realistically it would mean reaching some sort of compromise with the president. They'll say, we'll allow you to have this power that you want for this particular thing, but in the meantime, we're not going to allow you to do another thing you wanted. And so both sides get something, and the president doesn't have to veto it. So that means tariffs start in the legislature, just like the domestic taxes in my case, but from there, the paths diverge. I think that's a very supportable originalist view. To be fair, it's not necessarily what the courts have said, and at least in terms of their analysis. Courts have noted that in foreign policy areas, the non-delegation inquiry is watered down. In other cases, however, they've suggested that the non-delegation inquiry doesn't vary from power to power. I think that's probably not right, even in terms of the outcomes of particular cases. I'll focus on a case called Algonquin, which is from the 70s. It's a non-delegation case in part. It's essentially a paragraph about non-delegation, and then they move on to other aspects. They do not purport to apply any kind of originalism or anything like that, although I think they do ultimately reach the right answer under originalism. And so in Algonquin, they address Section 232, which is well known among trade experts, of the Trade Expansion Act. And the short version of it is Congress said that the president, if the president makes a determination that an importation of an article threatens to impair the national security, then he could take such action as he deems necessary to adjust the imports so it will not threaten the national security. And they even listed some factors for him to consider. So in Algonquin, what the president did was he said that imported oil raised or impaired the national security, and he would take such action as he deemed necessary to adjust it so that it wouldn't. The action he took was to impose increased license fees. So it wasn't a quantity restriction necessarily. It was essentially the imposition of an extra tariff on this oil. And the Supreme Court addressed that first and said, is this a non-delegation problem that the statute's so broad? No, this is in the 70s. They're not thinking about originalism. They say, we've got cases that talk about public interest. This clearly is at least as clear as that. We're done on non-delegation. And then, in terms of the specifics of it, they say, well, sure, the statute talks in broad terms like take such actions, but that allows what they call monetary methods. So in other words, broad language like take such action to remediate the threat would include imposing the equivalent of duties and tariffs. So they say it's not a non-delegation problem, and it's authorized by the statute. That's Algonquin from the 70s. So again, I think that reached the right outcome under an originalist view. I don't think they went through the proper analysis, which would be to say that, yes, this is an Article I power, yes, it's a legislative power, but it is not a strictly and exclusively legislative power in Chief Justice Marshall's terms. And I'm hoping that if the courts addressing the tariffs that have come out now actually reach the question, and we can talk about this later, that they will at least recognize that these Article I powers do differ from a non-delegation perspective. They won't just take the easy route, which is to say, oh, non-delegation, that's always a loser, and rule against the challengers. As I said, at the Supreme Court, I argued that the court should make that kind of distinction, and also, of course, make clear that domestic taxes are much different and must be very specific, and I hope that's the line that the courts draw. Thanks.
So before we move to impoundment, do you want to comment on the foreign affairs aspect?
Yeah, let me respond to a couple things. You first talked about how specific Congress has to be, and you said Marshall Field represented a statute that was quite specific. Well, if you read Marshall Field, the reason they upheld it on a non-delegation challenge, I think they're quite clear, is because the statute was specific. Like, that is the thing that counseled the court to uphold it, which, by the way, was over a dissent that was saying we should just apply non-delegation plainly. It doesn't matter what the authority is or not. And the other thing, too, is you talk about domestic taxation and you talk about the immigration, and I am conceding that there is probably more room, although I obviously believe there's a little bit less room than you do, for a delegation. But keep in mind that the power for the domestic taxation and for the tariff power, these are all revenue-raising tools that are in Article I, Section 8, and have very specific protections. And if you look at the history of our country, if you read the paper I wrote about this, I actually start with the Boston Tea Party, because I feel like the Boston Tea Party and the issues raised in the Boston Tea Party, I even quote some of the pamphlets from it, influence how the founders were thinking about how to allocate these duties out. They did not want a king who would fluctuate with the time and day on what economic policy was. And you might ask us later to predict an outcome for this case, and one of the reasons, or these cases, one of the reasons it's difficult is because the tariff policy seems to change on a daily basis, right? And the legislator, the reason we have even a bicameral, not just a unicameral legislator, is to prevent that sort of vacillation. You also bring up Curtis Wright as a bargaining chip. The thing about Curtis Wright is that that was another specific tariff regime that was created by Congress with specific things in it and then handed to the president as a bargaining chip. So I'm not arguing that they can't give the president the bargaining chip to challenge lack of reciprocity with other nations. But they have to set what that bargaining chip is and what those tariffs are. These statutes were upheld because they were specific. Now let me talk about Algonquin. I could just take the easy way out and say it's wrongly decided and then pass this down. I won't do that. I do think Algonquin is wrongly decided. Hang on, let me find my notes here. I don't have my notes. I'll do it from memory. The thing about Algonquin is, as you conceded, it's from the 1970s. We weren't really thinking so critically about non-delegation and constitutional issues in the 1970s. Algonquin was decided on the intelligible principle test, and it was also decided with an enormous use of legislative history to figure out what the president was authorized to do. And in its holding, in the last paragraph, the court is quite clear that the holding of Algonquin is very, very limited. They go out of their way to limit it just to these licensing fees. So while I think Algonquin would come out differently with a good application of the non-delegation test, let's assume Algonquin was rightly decided. And let's assume that we wanted to use the intelligible principle test. Anyone here familiar with the 232 statute? That was a hot topic a few years ago. It is very detailed. The Secretary of Treasury must receive a complaint or sua sponte start an investigation. He must do an investigation and find all these sorts of different facts. He then must make a recommendation. The president must adopt that recommendation. In implementing the recommendation, there's this huge block quote. I won't read it to you. Everyone will run out of the room, right? But there's this huge block quote of all the things the secretary has to do and think about and think about and think about. Open up IEPA, look for that for me. Not gonna find it, right? You're just gonna find a broad grant of power with no restrictions. So even if I don't think Algonquin, I think Algonquin, I hat tip this, I think it's the one case that's an aberration, right? But even if you do think it's rightly decided, doesn't resemble Algonquin in any way. And quite frankly, this broad-based delegation of tariff authority, this is new. Like, maybe you've got Algonquin that helps you. There's another case that was from the predecessor to the Federal Circuit called Yoshida. That has a lot of problems too. But even in that case, the court said this is not carte blanche for the president to do whatever tariffs he wants. Even in that case, which is quite generous to the tariff power. So in order to uphold this here, It's not that we're not bringing back the non-delegation doctrine. You were saying that all these cases and all this reasoning and all of this through history was wrong, and now we're going to give this just broad grant of authority. And I will submit, think about how this can be abused. This is a more practical argument than a legal argument, but imagine a Democratic president declares a green climate emergency, right, and puts 500% tariffs on everything that brings carbon into the United States or leads to carbon. They can craft economic or environmental policy using those tariffs in a tremendous way that really resembles what President Obama tried to do with the case that ended up being West Virginia v. EPA. These are the sorts of core legislative functions that the founders wouldn't even trust a unicameral legislator with. They had to give it to a bicameral legislator. Madison was afraid the unicameral legislator would run wild and do all this sorts of wild stuff. Certainly, they didn't mean to trust this very powerful authority to one person.
Let's move on to impoundment. Philip.
It's hard for me to refrain myself from speaking about the tariffs also.
He agrees with me, so jump in, Phil. Good.
Skip the spot.
I will just say one sentence and then move on, which is, even if you want to say IEPA and try to use it as a basis, the words in IEPA presumably have some meaning. And to say that an emergency is our balance of trade, and that's the emergency, is really to stretch the meaning of what that word means. So maybe we'll circle back to that. I'll try to stay in my lane now. Thank you so much for having me. I think both of these are very urgent issues. Let me follow the tried and true method that Eric has already employed and revert to the Declaration of Independence, apparently a newly relevant document. The very first complaint laid out is he has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. So this is that the colonial legislatures had tried to pass laws that the king subsequently canceled for his own purposes, and their expression of the people's search for the public good was therefore frustrated by royal arbitrariness. So, impoundment. Impoundment is the power to say that even though Congress said to spend money, the president may say no thank you. That, in fact, Congress is only capable of setting ceilings on spending and not setting floors. Congress can say spend $100 billion on this, but that's just a suggestion. That if the president doesn't like it, he may spend $95 billion or $95 million or $0. That's the sort of limit of what impoundment could mean. It could mean basically all spending is up to the president. Congress just makes suggestions. That would radically upend our separation of powers system. Congress is conceived of having the power of the purse. Congress sets appropriations laws into the U.S. Code. They're not a special category. They are laws. They instruct the president to disperse funds. Now, Congress is perfectly capable of creating lots and lots of flexibility, and it frequently does so. So going back to the Jefferson administration, if Congress says, we would like you to secure up to 15 gunboats on the Mississippi River by spending up to $50,000, and then President Jefferson says, oh, actually, the situation has changed. We don't need so many gunboats now that France has sold us Louisiana. I'm not going to spend any of this money. It's not an impoundment at all. That's the president using the flexibility built into the statute. And in an age when Congress was not continuously in session, that was an especially important thing for the president to be able to do. The president was much, much more nimble, and Congress recognizes that in all kinds of ways that it builds into its statutory spending injunctions, right, commands. So Congress gives lots of flexibility, even down to the present day, gives lots and lots of flexibility to reprogram money, it has different ways of requiring the timing of spending. It can require spending within a year, within 2 years, indefinitely. It knows how to give flexibility to the executive branch, and it often sees that it is wise to do so and chooses to do so. But again, the impoundment power at its strongest would be to say that nevertheless, all those are just suggestions, and that ultimately it's up to the president to decide what's worth spending money on. And as an administrative prerogative inherent in the executive authority, the president has to have the flexibility not to spend. Now, when does this sound best? Waste, fraud, and abuse. How could the president possibly be forced to spend money on things that are waste, fraud, and abuse? That does sound very bad. And I think those of us who are fighting against impoundment as a general principle ought to be clear. Not all impoundments really are probably created equal. This is not a rule of law crisis if Congress says, spend $100 billion to accomplish X, and it doesn't give any flexibility. Then the president says, I've accomplished X by spending $95 billion. Here's $5 billion I'm not going to spend on this. Is that a constitutional crisis? No, it's not. And in fact, Congress passing rescissions to recover money of that sort is a fairly routine matter. No one's going to get too bent out of shape about that. When Congress sets a goal, the executive says, okay, I'm with you on the goal, I'm executing, and I've done it better than you imagined I could. That's quite different than Congress saying, here's a goal, let's appropriate $100 billion to pursue this goal. The president saying, no, thank you, I think that goal is not worthy. I don't think that's in the public good. I think that would be wasteful or fraud or abuse, and therefore I will spend $0. Because I think the process by which Congress decided on this law, by the way, which I signed my name to, or was passed over my veto, that's not often the case, that I signed my name to, nevertheless, that was somehow a corrupt, bad process that needs to be canceled on the back end. That is a very violent rebalancing of power toward the executive branch. Again, at the extreme, it says that the president's policy judgment is simply takes priority over the legislature's. That's, again, backwards to what America's framers were trying to achieve by severing their ties to the king. Now, where are we today? The administration has not, in fact, set out a strong legal position that it believes that it can and is doing impoundment, and everyone should live with that. That's going to face a tough road in the courts. It's probably not constitutional under current case law. Perhaps Mr. Soskin will tell us why it ought to be, but it's probably not under current case law. They have not gone out and stuck their necks out and said, we want to have that fight. They have instead done a lot of termination of federal personnel, termination of contracts, which is probably not impoundment. There's a whole different set of rules governing contracts, the federal acquisitions regulations. They say that they're delaying. It's not clear exactly how long these delays will last, maybe indefinitely, maybe not. We're shutting down this agency, but maybe somehow the program spending is going to pop up in some other department. So they've muddied the waters quite a bit. The impoundment issue is not super clearly in front of us on anything, and yet much of what they've done, including much of what they've done under the heading of the Department of Government Efficiency, looks a lot like a de facto impoundment. And there are an awful lot of litigants who have brought cases citing the Impoundment Control Act of 1974 as reason to find the administration's actions illegal. And so we have yet to see whether courts will take these actions, which do not call themselves impoundments, but look a lot like impoundments, and treat them that way in court. Now, I think it's worth saying, who should really defend against this abuse? It's Congress that ought to defend its own prerogatives, and mostly Congress is not doing so today. Why not? Well, there's a sense that is not incorrect that the congressional appropriations process has some real problems. The congressional budget process is a complete farce. The congressional authorizations processes that are supposed to reauthorize every spending program on a periodic basis, largely in shambles. So there's a sense that Congress is sort of hustling spending through, yes, with votes every year in many cases, or on autopilot, in many other cases, and that the processes that it's using to do that are not serious processes. They don't really have enough scrutiny for how this money is being spent. They're letting all kinds of waste, fraud, and abuse go unchecked. A lot of legislators themselves feel this way. And so they're happy enough to sort of sit back and say, well, maybe the president can do some useful things on this front. Maybe, whether it has a strong legal basis for doing so or not, he's going to make some things happen that look good to us. Now, if we're saying if they believe in these actions, there is a legally prescribed program by which you can take money back. It's the rescissions process set into law by the Impoundment Control Act of 1974. That allows the president to stop money for a limited time, send a message to Congress saying, I want to stop this permanently, and Congress then can, on an expedited procedural basis, put that to a vote, where the only kind of amendment they can consider is sort of which things to package together. So rescission would be Congress actually asserting its power. If they like what the president's doing, that is clearly what they ought to be doing. It's in the works, maybe looking like more likely than not we'll see some kind of rescissions package, although really the size and scope of it won't match what the broader activity in this administration. So Congress can try to get its own sense of responsibility working. That's really the constitutionally preferred solution to all this. I think sort of resigning ourselves to a Congress that isn't capable of grappling with these issues and saying that our only hope is a president that's willing to do it really puts us in a constitutionally frightening place, and I hope it doesn't come to that.
Eric?
Well, if you know anything about me other than the lovely introduction by Elizabeth a little while ago, you won't be surprised to hear that I'm up here to advocate for a maximalist view of executive power, presidential power, when it comes to impoundment. And that's because a few months ago, I was removed from my previous position as Inspector General at the Department of Transportation by President Trump. And I then became a little bit famous and a lot infamous, I guess depending who you talk to, for authoring an amicus brief that said, no, in fact, President Trump was well within his power to remove me, notwithstanding a statute that said, nope, the president has to keep inspectors general in office for a 30-day period during which he provides notice to Congress. And that statutory scheme, the 30 days notice, looks a lot like the 45 days notice provided in the Impoundment Control Act, a 45-day period in which presumably Congress is provided a period of time to act. But I set out, agreed to be on this panel, thinking that I could take a really strong position, saying that the Impoundment Control Act represented yet another raid on executive power in the 1970s, and one that we should be very suspicious of. And as I dug a little bit into the Impoundment Control Act, acronym ICA, it's not as fun to say as IEPA, to the other Eric's point, but as I dug into this a little bit, I found that the debate that we're having a little on impoundment is one that is really marked by some fuzziness in terms of the concepts. So I think what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is a little bit less critique of the 1970s Congress and a little more just discussion of what some of these fuzzy concepts are and how they are influencing the terms of the debate, our understanding of the ICA and the Constitution. And then talk a little bit about how the ICA indeed fits into this pendulum of executive power and legislative branch power, before closing with why we should value impoundment and it wouldn't be a huge constitutional crisis if we saw more of it, at least certainly not in the current circumstances. So let's start with this idea that the ICA has enacted a prohibition on impoundments except by following certain procedures set forth by Congress. What we mean when we talk about impoundment is the non-use of appropriated funds by the executive branch. That is, Congress appropriates $100 billion, and the $100 billion, some or all of it, doesn't get spent. We know when Congress sets forth an appropriation for $10 billion that sets a maximum, a ceiling of $10 billion that the president can spend. And the question about impoundment is whether appropriations also sets a floor. If it is phrased as, you shall spend $10 billion, does the president have to do it? And the common formulation for describing the 1974 ICA, even by its critics, reads something like, quote, the ICA requires the president to spend the entirety of any money Congress appropriates on time unless explicitly given permission otherwise. And that's in one of the recent articles critiquing the ICA and supporting impoundment. But that's not really what the ICA does, if you look carefully. It requires reporting to Congress about two types of impoundment: rescissions, meaning I want Congress to take the money back, or deferrals, I'm going to spend it on later. And GAO, which has been appointed by the ICA to be the enforcing authority for it, maybe a little more on that later. Well, GAO has already identified a third category of impoundments, one that appears nowhere in the text of the ICA, for something that it calls programmatic delays. And most recently, GAO stated that the idea of a programmatic delay allowed President Biden to entirely withhold the appropriated funding for construction of the border wall when he took office and decided that the border wall no longer aligned with his administration's priorities. It's not the specific example that matters. It's the GAO, as its congressionally provided interpretive power, saying, hey, here's a third category of impoundment, an extra textual one, something that doesn't fall within the prohibition of the ICA at all. And that seems to indicate to me that the ICA is not, in fact, exhaustive of all of the possibilities for impoundments. So maybe we don't need to have this debate at all. If you read the definitions of rescission and deferral, which I'm not going to do here, I think there is probably room for a lot of muddying the waters entirely consistent with the statute. And that may explain why the executive has not said we are carrying out impoundments under the Act, because maybe they are not. That brings us to fuzzy concept number 2. What is it that the ICA actually does require? Well, it requires the president to follow these procedures to rescind or defer appropriated funds. And if he doesn't follow those procedures, or Congress doesn't approve them, then the president must, quote, make available for obligation, unquote, those funds. No, that isn't he must obligate those funds or must spend those funds, but just must make available for obligation. And that comes from a really non-unitary executive view in the 1970s that I think is just overtaken by our understanding of the Constitution today. It's this idea that the president's only opportunity to prevent some inferior officials in the executive branch, whether they're principal officers or inferior officers, or even just employees, there's only opportunity to keep them from spending is by saying, I'm not even giving you the authority to make those funds available for obligation. And Congress actually knows that making funds available for obligation, basically putting them out in a way that there's a contractual responsibility to spend them, and then they get spent, Congress knows that that doesn't mean necessarily the funds will get spent. You can take a look at 31 U.S.C. 1552 and 1553, in which Congress provides a whole set of procedures for what happens to appropriated, unobligated funds at the end of a fiscal year. And in fact, how if you're an agency head, as I recently was, in some cases you can access those unobligated funds for 5 more years after the end of the fiscal year. And then ultimately those unobligated funds get canceled and are no longer available for obligation. This is a routine part of federal agency financial management that every agency does, and no one ever reports pursuant to the ICA. you do this as a good management practice because maybe you obligate funds for a construction project in fiscal year 2024. And in fiscal year 2026, you discover, oh, it's going to cost $1 million more than we thought because the price of goods and labor has gone up due to inflation. And so you leave the funds behind and you spend them later. But if they don't get spent, they get returned to the Treasury. Now, there's a lot of complexity of this. You have to really be an appropriations lawyer to understand what are the circumstances in which funds that are available for obligation then have to be obligated, and is it discretionary or not. But I think overall this is cause for skepticism, again, about how far does the ICA actually reach. Final area of fuzziness I want to talk about, and this relates more to the constitutional question. You heard this in the introduction, that this is about Congress's power of the purse. And opponents of impoundment always say, look, Congress has the power of the purse. They get the power to control how this money is spent. And impoundment sure sounds like it's in the power of the purse, but that's not a phrase you're going to find anywhere in the Constitution, or even the Declaration of Independence, I think. The Appropriations Clause says, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury except in consequence of appropriations made by law. That is a ceiling provision. It says Congress sets the maximum or the bases for which money can be spent. It says nothing about a power to set a floor. Now, to be sure, in 2023, in CFPB versus CFSAA, maybe one of those can be pronounced in a clever way, but I can't do it. We saw some debate about what the word appropriations means in that text. And Justice Thomas, in the majority opinion, set forth the ceiling view that, quote, an appropriation is simply a law that authorizes expenditures from a specified source of public money for designated purposes. And in dissent, Justice Alito had a somewhat different interpretation of appropriations. He said it can't just be a ceiling provision, that it requires closer legislative control over the source and disposition of the monies used to finance the government. But if you look there, I think you'll see that Justice Alito's concern is really with the question of whether the king could rule without Parliament. It really does continue to align with a ceiling view, not so much the idea that appropriations provides a floor-setting authority. There's a long history of presidential impoundments dating to Thomas Jefferson. I don't think I'm going to have time to get into that. What I find more interesting than the specific examples, though, is that in the context of many of those examples, in the Jefferson administration, the Grant administration, the Eisenhower administration, even members of Congress took the position that the president had inherent executive authority under the vesting clause, under the take care clause, to impound funds. In the Truman administration, the House Appropriations Committee actually explained that any appropriation is, quote, a ceiling and should be managed to expend as little as possible. Okay, 1970s roll around. This is why I had hoped to really spend today talking about before I found that it was fuzzy. For the last 50 years, people have read the ICA and it's signing into law by President Nixon as sort of disposing of the debate over whether Congress constitutionally has the power to set an appropriations floor. I just want to suggest that we should be skeptical of overreading the ICA and its signing as being dispositive here. We know that this took place during a nadir in executive branch power and prestige. In fact, the ICA was one of the very last statutes that President Nixon signed into law before he resigned. And it took place after several of his vetoes at least had been overridden by a hostile Congress. And one of the thought leaders of the ICA in the years leading up to its enactment was none other than Senator Frank Church. dedicated leftist who I think spearheaded much of the assault on executive power in the 1970s. He severed U.S. foreign assistance to South Vietnam legislatively. He held the hearings, the Church Committee that led to the defanging of U.S. intelligence that hampered us in the 80s, the 90s, and the 00s. In the process, he wrote in some clearly unconstitutional elements to the ICA. Most notably, it places the Controller General, the CG, a legislative branch official, in charge of enforcing the Impoundment Control Act, including by bringing suit against the executive branch to enforce the terms of the ICA. Now, this sort of enforcement authority, which under the Biden administration, the Department of Justice argued precluded any private cause of action for anyone else to enforce the ICA, I don't think can rest, and I don't think many people will agree, can't rest in a legislative branch official appointed by Congress. So I think there's a real doubt about the ICA and whether, on the whole, it should be constitutional. I suspect I'm getting close to my time here.
You're out of time.
I am out of time.
Can you wrap up so we have time for Q&A?
Let me just close with something from my current position, leading up government efficiency and reform efforts in Florida. I want to say this. The president needs impoundment authority. The government is spending other people's money, and in that context, it is hard enough, I suppose you could say it's spending our money, but the individual officials spending it, it is hard enough to give them incentives to be economical in any case. But to say what the ICA does on its face, that any time you save money, you have to report to Congress and get their permission not to spend it all, that's absurd on its face. And to Philip's point that this involves appropriations that the president signed his name to, well, I think the current circumstances show that actually democratic accountability is undermined in the absence of impoundment. Because the way the federal fiscal year works is we're still in the first third of the fiscal year with budgets adopted by a previous president and previous Congresses. The budget cycle for the next fiscal year is well underway. For presidents to be elected with a mandate of change on important issues like spending and then be unable, without action by Congress, to change what that spending is, even to any dollar, would completely frustrate our ability to elect a new president to restore confidence that the government acts to secure and in service of the interests of the people. Thank you for allowing me the extra minute there.
Philip, it looks like you're itching to respond.
Itching. I think this is an exercise in misdirection away from the basic questions of constitutional logic that are at stake here. Is it a matter of, oh, the executive branch has to spend down to the last jot and tittle, and for him to do anything else would be a constitutional crisis? I didn't say anything like that. I said that it's quite different when the president says, waste, fraud, and abuse is enough for me to cancel a whole program of many tens of billions of dollars that Congress has just appropriated for, and I have signed the appropriations law for, because I say this program is not an apple with a worm in it, but is a ball of worms. Okay? That's what he said about USAID. That's his justification. It doesn't sound anything like administration just leads me to get some efficiencies. I think this whole program is bad, and I am canceling it because that is my way to vindicate the American people's interest. Well, if you care about bicameralism and presentment, that doesn't sound like the process by which we're supposed to make decisions about how to use our public resources. And you can say, oh, well, since we're saving public resources, it's great. But no, that's not the legislative process that the Constitution sets out.
If the president has the power to set aside funds, notwithstanding the text of the ICA, for administrative efficiency that Philip concedes is valid, that power has to come from somewhere. My view is that it is an inherent executive power to decide not to spend the funds appropriated by Congress. And we view the president as having expansive powers and the legislature as having ones clearly delineated
And so
by the
you
Constitution.
started off by saying that you're a maximalist in presidentialism. Do you agree that your position just puts the president as the priority decision maker on all spending for the whole government?
The outcome of having the president have discretion that survives the ICA, if you believe that the ICA constrains discretion in this area, means yes.
So I want to invite anyone who has a question to queue up at the microphones, but I have one to sort of kick things off. So I'm wondering what implications the demise of Chevron deference and the rise of the major questions doctrine might have for any of these discussions. Tariffs and impoundment sure sound like matters of economic and political significance, so I'll throw that out to the panel.
Yeah, major questions. I'll begin by disclaiming that I don't like the major questions doctrine that much because I feel like it didn't go far enough. I know I'm cabining my comments here on delegation to executive authority, but I'm pretty out there on non-delegation doctrine, and I felt like major questions doctrine was just a halfway to get there. I think we should go the whole way. I think after the demise of Chevron, major questions is really being treated as a threshold Chevron question in many respects, right? In order to avoid getting to Chevron deference, right, we would exercise the major questions doctrine, we didn't have to worry about it. Well, now with the advent of Loper-Bright and with the single best meaning of a statute, and I've written about this elsewhere, I question the long-term viability of the major questions doctrine because in studying how circuit courts have treated it, I found that the conservative circuits are equally as frustrated about it as I am, I think. And they're just saying, I don't need it anymore, right? I can just look at it. Now, you look at the tariff power, it is hard to imagine a more question of vast economic and political significance than the tariff power. But I would urge the court, if they're listening, I don't think they are, to just use all the cases that are out there. Use Marshall Field. Use all these cases that talk about what the limits of the tariff power are and say this is a step too far in non-delegation. There's no reason to say major questions, which really is going to avoid getting to the discrete question at issue there. So yes, I'm going to be honest though, major questions is probably the most likely, if they are struck down, it's probably the most likely tool they'll use, but I would hope that they would just say, see, all these cases, this is a step too far, there's no specificity. Congress, if you want to do this, cure the constitutional defect, and we'll talk about it then.
I do like the major questions doctrine, and I think it is right on point here. We don't want to hide elephants. We don't want to presume that Congress hides elephants in mouse holes. And the way that the Trump administration would like to read IEPA would mean that actually Congress hid a grant to change all the tariffs on any country in the world all the time in this emergency statute that never once mentions tariffs. I'd say it seems like a perfect application of the doctrine.
I'll add really quickly. Usually we say canon of constitutional avoidance, and you say, oh, they're probably just going to rule on the statute. I think this is a weird situation where ruling on the constitutional issue may not have as broad impacts as ruling on the statutory issue. Because I think there's 39 active national emergencies. Did everyone know that? Some of them are older than me. And I think if they rule on the statute and defining what an emergency is and what the powers are, it could imperil a lot of those things that are longstanding U.S. policy. And academically, great, I'm fine with that. I'm not sure the court pragmatically would be. And if you rule on the constitutional issue here, you would just kind of get this power as applied, and then we deal with the rest when it comes to it.
I do think that major questions is largely premised on skepticism of executive agencies. I'm not aware of cases that have applied it to the presidency, maybe one of the Biden vaccine mandates perhaps, but I do think that's going to be like a very interesting wrinkle. And also the fact that it involves national security, and courts are going to have to try to work in the Algonquin case, which allowed the president to have very broad powers in this area. Now, obviously, they didn't say, and this satisfies the major question doctrine because they hadn't really thought of it at that time. But I do think, I think Eric's right. The courts probably will kind of jump to major questions doctrine if they want to rule in favor of the challengers. But I don't think it's as simple as some of these other cases we've had recently about that.
Your question.
Yeah, Eric, Trent, I don't have a question for you two. My question is to Phil. What do you do with the Brewster's Millions problem? that they've given the president money, and instead of inflation or anything, there's massive deflation. Like right now, we're having oil price drops. And if he just fails to spend the money, because you really can't in a deflationary area, and he hasn't done it willfully, is that impoundment or is that something else? What is that?
I thought the way Eric described changing prices, changing circumstances lead to fairly routine mismatches between dollar amounts in statutes and actually realized, expenditures. And we deal with that all the time, and appropriations committees know what to do about it, and it's not any kind of scandal, it's the work of government. That's all fine. Nobody's getting excited about any of that. The problem is if you pretend that that principle somehow gets you all the way to Eric's presidential maximalist position, which I don't see why it would.
Hi, Don Kroll. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Don Kroll. My question is about IEPA and Section 232. So I was at the Department of Commerce in Trump 1. I worked on a lot of the litigation with the steel and aluminum tariffs, obviously under Section 232. As I understand the non-delegation argument, it really is about setting the rate of the tariffs. But Section 232 says that's okay. You mentioned Algonquin. We've also had a couple other circuit court decisions in the past 3 years that have upheld. Supreme Court denied cert in one of those. So how do you reconcile that with your argument? And I know one mention was the procedure that Section 232 follows, but unless you're doing a procedural challenge, you can kind of skip over that because it also says the president can just disagree with that, the whole process the Secretary of Commerce follows. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the cop-out is Algonquin got it wrong and 232 is unlawful too, right? And that's a cop-out on I'll admit that, right? As I said, and Trent has made me think very critically about this as we've been talking about in emails this week. Algonquin is an aberration. I mean, I'll concede that openly. And it's an issue, and it's actually something I'm going to add into my paper. But I just think if you look at the decision in Algonquin, it doesn't resemble anything like we're talking about with non-delegation in the present day. I mean, it is a court that is detached from what I think Trent was just arguing before the Supreme Court, and that you would see in the Gundy dissent, even from Justice Gorsuch. So I think if this court were to take something, now they had turned down, so in 2020, there was a case, the Steele case, that was appealed up to the Supreme Court from the Federal Circuit, and the Federal Circuit ruled and affirmed on Algonquin. Maybe you were involved in that one, I'm not sure. And the Supreme Court denied cert there. Now, the Supreme Court's denied cert on a lot of non-delegation questions. So I think Algonquin itself gets the non-delegation doctrine wrong. And it's also a decision that's just filled with legislative history and this and that and exceeding the text and all of this and intelligible principle. And I still think that if you look at the 232 tariff statute, right, first of all, look at the express delegations of authority that are given to the president under 232. So if you're going to concede that 232 did give the ability to, in Algonquin, it was licensing fees, but to create tariffs, I mean, maybe you end up having a Youngstown problem where the Congress knew how to give this authority, knew how to give it specifically, gave it in this statute, right? And we're going to say there's another statute out there that just generically gives this authority broadly. I mean, at that point, we might have an issue of Congress spoke clearly here, it didn't speak clearly there, and therefore IEPA cannot be read to give all this power. Otherwise, why have 232 at all, right? And why have all the principles in 232? Why have all of the factors in there? So again, my cop-out answer is that it's wrongly decided, but I think even if it is rightly decided, if you're a litigant, you can make a pretty clever argument that the existence of 232 imperils the ability of the president to claim some sort of tariff authority under IEPA, given that it is specifically enumerated by Congress in a different statute. And I guess, I know all the canons and we can go back and forth. I'm in peri materia, right? I get it. I know all the arguments back and forth. I'm just saying that is the argument I would make if I were a litigant on this.
Thank you.
Yeah, so on the procedural hurdles, this was a point I was going to raise if I got another chance. So this came up in my FCC case at the Supreme Court where the FCC was required to consider a bunch of factors, but none of them were binding. And there's a case from 1938, I think it is, Rock Royal Co-op Supreme Court non-delegation case that says procedural hurdles can't save an improper delegation. And you could define, I guess it's somewhat self-defining as to what that means, but I cited that case quite a bit for the argument that having to consider something that you don't actually have to follow in the end, it's not like some of the IEPA parts where it's like, you must make this determination, you must make this finding. But there are others, they're just mere considerations. I said that can't be enough to save it because they don't actually impose any kind of substantive restriction. And I don't know what the court will do with that.
Yeah, good question. Thank you.
Andy LaPerriere, not a lawyer. But I wanted to ask, for those who wanted to kind of defend the use of IEPA here, what would be the limiting principle? The example of the, declare climate change, 500% tariffs. What if what the president's doing is legal under IEPA? What isn't illegal under IEPA? What isn't? It just strikes me as a almost unlimited authority.
I have no idea. I mean, if this is lawful, I don't know what the limiting principle is, to be completely honest with you. And I think the response that you would see from an advocate is, well, those tariffs would be targeted. They would be specifically discriminating against a certain industry and all of that. But if we're reading IEPA the way I see the defenders of this reading it, the president is given incredible discretion that whatever he believes is a national emergency. And I think you would even have a better argument to upholding these targeted green energy tariffs, because at least it's targeted at a specific enumerated emergency rather than just a generic declaration of a trade emergency. So I know that did not answer your question at all, but one of the things that really bothers me about this is if there's no limit here, in the most maximal use of the tariff power that I can imagine, I can't see a limit anywhere else.
Yeah, the Supreme Court, I don't necessarily agree with these opinions, but the Supreme Court has upheld delegations to agencies that largely turn on, quote, the public interest. And as I've said, I think those cases are probably wrong. I think you can interpret them more narrowly, but if you allow agencies to exercise such incredible power in the public interest, I don't see how it's that much different than saying the president can make determinations when he finds a national security or a national emergency or that sort of thing. Like, if the framework is the same, I don't see why it would vary. If anything, this would receive even less non-delegation scrutiny because it does involve foreign relations. Now, again, I said I think a lot of the public interest, quote, statutes do not survive non-delegation inquiry, and that's why we addressed those in our Supreme Court brief. But if those are going to stand, I don't see why this one's so much different.
Basically, we have a bogus emergency declaration, and we have layered on top of that reasoning that makes no sense in justification of the tariffs. Not only do we put 10% tariffs on all countries as a baseline if we have a trade deficit with them, we put a 10% tariff on them if we happen to have a trade surplus. If you're going to say that that's good enough reasoning because, boy, in national security matters, the president gets a lot of deference, I'm sorry, that is, you've opened the door to the president can offer whatever bogus argument he wants to do whatever he wants.
Yep.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yes. Hi, Paul Cameron. First, I want to congratulate Eric for supporting President Trump's firing of you. And I got to tell you, you've got support from Democratic Senator Ron Wyden, because back in the Biden administration, he fired Trump's appointee to the Social Security Administration, and at that time, Ron Wyden said, quote, "Every president should choose the personnel that will best carry out their vision for the country. To fulfill President Biden's bold vision for improving and expanding Social Security, he needs his people in charge." So, that's what Trump is doing, but now that Trump's doing it, the Democrats are screaming. Going back to the Impoundment Control Act, you're right about the GAO Comptroller General. There's a problem with separation of powers where he's removable by the Congress, and under Bosher versus Sinar, that's very problematic. But in terms of, Mr. Wallach, in terms of, what I hear you saying is that it's okay for the president to reduce the appropriations if he can accomplish the goal in a cheaper way, but what you oppose for him to not do anything if he doesn't like the goal. So, I mean, for example, if Congress says you should give $5 billion to Iran, and he goes, well, wait a minute, that's against our national security, et cetera, and he doesn't want to give a penny to Iran. He doesn't like the goal. Are you saying the president didn't have the power to do that?
He has a veto.
Yeah, no, I understand. But assume the law was in there before he got elected. I'm just asking about the president's power. Or his veto's overridden, for example. So I want you to get to the point. When does he have the power to oppose the goal?
So if we're actually looking at specific cases, then you could imagine some where the national security justification seems very compelling. And even this argument that somehow I've seen what my predecessor determined about the world and it was very wrong and I need to reverse it in a hurry. and I can't wait for Congress to change the law. I have to change it now. That is at least, that's a case that you can consider on the merits.
Okay.
That's
Fair
a lot
enough.
different from saying, here's an appropriations law that we just signed together, that I just signed into law, but actually I don't like this part of it and I'm going to zero it out. So I think when you look at individual cases, some of them look a lot like just routine administrative, friction that you deal with. Some of them look like radically changed circumstances where you can make an argument about, I'm more nimble than you, Congress. I have to stop this now, and I hope you'll support me in stopping it for good. That sounds like a perfect case for a rescissions law. But again, all of that is wildly different from saying that even though I'm participating in the appropriations process and signing these bills into laws, actually I get to change them. The Congress tried to give the president a power like that with the line item veto in the 1990s, and the Supreme Court said that would so badly unbalance the separation of powers that it is unconstitutional to do so. So even when Congress wanted to do that, the Supreme Court said it was impermissible. There's no evidence Congress wants to do it right now.
I will say, if you trace the history of discussions about impoundment, there's always been a careful effort to distinguish impoundments from an item veto, which for some reason historically was always the item veto and not the line item veto. I'm not sure when the line got added. But I think you will see most opponents of impoundment will generally grant that in some of the foreign affairs or military situations, like the one in that example, most people agree that the president has some impoundment authority, just as if Congress were to legislate that these funds must be used to prosecute a particular person. The president has inherent executive authority over the choice of whom to prosecute. So Congress can't mandate that. And I suspect when we have a better fleshed out universe of impoundment precedents, the ultimate outcome is going to be something that distinguishes on the basis of the type of power at issue, rather than just says the president has inherent power to zero out every program. However, I'm not as concerned that that leaves Congress utterly powerless to act or accomplish its objectives as Philip is. I think that what we have seen in that history is that when the president seeks to cancel out programs through impoundment, what does it do? It does what we usually see in interbranch disputes. It opens up a conversation between the legislature and the executive branch that gets compromised on in legislation.
Well, on that note, we've come to the end of our time. So please join me in thanking our panelists.